Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Last month, something happened at my farm that completely changed how I think about living alone out here. And honestly, I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I'm 47, been farming corn and soybeans on my family's property in rural Iowa for the past 20 years. Ever since my dad passed and left me the land. The nearest neighbor is about 8 miles down the county road, and the closest town with a real police station is a good 30-minute drive. Never bothered me much being isolated. I had my German Shepherd Duke and a shotgun in the closet. Figured that was enough. The property is about 300 acres, with the main house sitting up on a small hill, the barn about 50 yards away, and equipment sheds scattered around. That night in October it was unseasonably warm, the kind of thick, humid air that makes you leave windows cracked even though you know better. My wife had left me 2 years earlier, said she couldn't handle the isolation anymore, and since then it's just been me and Duke out here. Duke woke me up around 2 a.m. with the kind of barking I'd never heard from him before. Not his usual alert bark when a deer crosses the property, but something primal and aggressive that made every hair on my neck stand up. He was downstairs, throwing himself against the back door, claws scraping against the wood, deep growls between each bark. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and headed downstairs in my boxers and t-shirt, figuring maybe a coyote had gotten too close to the chicken coop again. Through the kitchen window, I could see Duke's silhouette in the moonlight, rigid and focused on something near the barn. I grabbed his collar to calm him down, but he nearly pulled me off my feet trying to get outside. That's when I noticed it. The barn's main door was slightly open, just a foot or so, but enough to see pure darkness inside where my floodlight should have been illuminating the interior. The automatic sensor light I'd installed last year wasn't on, which meant either it was broken or someone had disabled it. I let Duke lead me outside, keeping him on a short leash even though he was pulling hard enough to choke himself. The gravel crunched under my bare feet as we approached the barn, and that's when I saw the padlock, or what was left of it. The heavy-duty master lock I'd bought just 6 months ago was lying in the dirt, cut clean through with what must have been industrial bolt cutters. My chest got tight when I realized this wasn't some kids messing around. Inside the barn, my flashlight beam swept across empty spaces where my tools should have been. The new Husqvarna chainsaw, gone. My grandfather's tool collection that I'd restored piece by piece, gone. The welding equipment I'd saved 3 seasons to afford, gone. But they'd been selective. They left the old rusty stuff and only took the valuable items, which meant they knew exactly what they were looking for. Duke suddenly went silent, his body trembling against my leg, and that scared me more than all his barking had. I rushed back to the house with Duke, locked the door behind us, and called 911. The dispatcher sounded bored, probably used to farmers calling about stolen equipment, and said a deputy would be out in the morning to take a report. Morning. I explained that whoever did this might still be around, but she just repeated that property theft wasn't an emergency unless there was immediate danger to life. After hanging up, I loaded my shotgun and sat in the kitchen with all the lights off, watching through the windows. Duke stayed pressed against my legs, occasionally letting out these low, nervous whines I'd never heard from him. Around 3:30 a.m., just when I was starting to think they were long gone, I heard it. Gravel popping under tires, but no engine sound. Someone was rolling down my driveway with their headlights off, letting gravity pull them down the slight slope toward my house. My driveway is about a quarter-mile long, lined with old oak trees my grandmother planted 60 years ago, and it curves twice before reaching the house. From the kitchen window, I could just make out a dark shape, a pickup truck, maybe a Ford F-150 from the outline, creeping closer. They stopped about 100 feet from the house, right where the driveway opens up into the main yard. For maybe 5 minutes, nothing happened. Just silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then 2 figures got out, and even in the moonlight I could tell they were both big men. one wearing what looked like a baseball cap, the other with long hair tied back. They stood there looking at my house, and one of them pointed at different windows like they were planning something. The long-haired one went back to the truck and pulled out what I recognized as a crowbar, the kind I used to have in my own barn before they stole it. They started walking toward my house, not rushing, just casual like they owned the place. The one with the cap tried the handle on my truck first, found it locked, then peered through the window with a small flashlight. Duke was growling so low it was almost inaudible. His whole body coiled like a spring. I picked up my phone to call 911 again, but I had no signal. Not unusual out here, but the timing made my mouth go dry. The two men split up, one heading toward the front porch, the other disappearing around the side of the house toward the back door. I heard the doorknob on the front door turn slowly, testing it, then harder, rattling it. A few seconds later, the back door got the same treatment. They were checking every entrance, and I knew those old locks wouldn't hold up against a crowbar for more than a few seconds. I had to make a choice: stay hidden and hope they'd leave, or let them know I was armed and ready. I decided to make my presence known before they broke in. I flipped on the porch light and yelled through the door that I had a 12 gauge pointed right at them, and the police were already on their way. For a moment, everything stopped. Then I heard the one at the back door walking through the grass, moving fast back toward the front. They met up in the yard, maybe 30 feet from my front window, and just stood there talking to each other. I couldn't make out the words, but their body language had changed, less casual, more agitated. The long-haired one kept gesturing at the house while the other one shook his head. Then the one with the cap called out in this weirdly calm voice, said his name was Brandon, and they just needed to get something they'd left behind earlier, something that belonged to them. He said they didn't want any trouble, just needed 5 minutes in the barn. The way he said it, so reasonable and matter-of-fact, made it somehow more terrifying than if he'd been screaming threats. I told them to get off my property immediately or I'd start shooting, putting as much authority in my voice as I could manage. Brandon laughed, not a mean laugh, but genuine amusement, like I'd told him a joke. He said I should think real careful about my next move because they knew I was alone out here, knew exactly how long it would take the sheriff to arrive if I even managed to call them. The other one, the long-haired guy, started walking toward the house again, but Brandon grabbed his arm and said something that made him stop. Then Brandon looked directly at my window, even though I was sure he couldn't see me in the dark, and said they'd be back for what was theirs. Maybe tonight, maybe next week, maybe next month. He said I should consider moving into town for a while, somewhere with neighbors close by. They walked back to their truck, taking their time, and the engine started up smooth and quiet, definitely a newer model. As they drove away with their headlights still off, I noticed they'd removed the license plates. I stayed up the rest of the night with the shotgun across my lap, Duke alert beside me, checking every window in rotation. When the sun finally came up around 6:30, I went back to the barn to look for whatever they claimed they'd left behind. In the daylight, I noticed things I'd missed before. Cigarette butts near the door that weren't mine, boot prints in the dirt that were way bigger than my size 10s, and strangest of all, fresh scratches on the concrete floor like they'd dragged something heavy out recently. Behind where I used to keep my welding equipment, I found a loose floorboard I'd never noticed in 15 years of using that barn. Underneath was an empty space, about 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide, with plastic wrapping residue stuck to the sides and a chemical smell that made me step back quick. Whatever had been hidden there, they'd already taken it the first time. They'd been using my barn as a stash spot probably for months and came back thinking they'd left something else behind. The deputy showed up around noon, a young guy named Officer Garrett who looked fresh out of the academy. He took pictures, filled out paperwork, and tried to act professional, but I could tell he was out of his depth when I showed him the hidden compartment. His whole demeanor changed. He called his supervisor, who called the state police, and within 2 hours I had detectives crawling all over my property. They found more evidence I'd missed, tire tracks from at least 3 different vehicles over the past few months, a trail camera in the trees that had been watching my house, and chemical residue in the barn that made them call in a hazmat team. Turns out Brandon and his friend had been cooking methamphetamines in a mobile lab, using isolated barns around the county as temporary storage sites for their supplies and product. The detective, a woman named Lieutenant Foster, told me I was lucky they hadn't decided to eliminate a potential witness. She said they'd probably been watching me for weeks, learning my routines, waiting for the right time to clear out their stash. The police set up surveillance on my property for the next week, thinking Brandon might actually come back, but he never did. They caught him and 2 others 3 weeks later at a traffic stop 2 counties over, the truck bed full of stolen farming equipment and enough meth to put them away for 20 years. Lieutenant Foster called to tell me they found my tools at a pawn shop in Nebraska, and I'd get most of them back after the trial. Brandon, whose real name turned out to be Brandon Holloway, had a record going back 15 years. Assault, armed robbery, manufacturing charges. The long-haired guy was his cousin, Wayne Holloway, equally dangerous with warrants in 3 states. They'd been using rural properties across Iowa and Nebraska for their operation, picking farms with elderly or isolated owners. I wasn't their first victim, but thankfully I was their last on this run. The trial is set for January, and I'll have to testify, which means facing them again in court. Lieutenant Foster assured me they'll be in custody until then, but I still catch myself checking those windows at night. I've made changes since that night. Put up motion sensors around the entire property that alert my phone, installed cameras with night vision, and got a second dog, a Rottweiler named Bear, who makes Duke look friendly. Even thought about selling the farm and moving to town like Brandon suggested. But this land has been in my family for 4 generations, and I'll be damned if some meth dealers are going to drive me off it. My ex-wife called after she heard what happened, said maybe I should reconsider living alone out here. But I told her I'd rather face a dozen Brandons than give up this place. Still, on quiet nights when the dogs start barking at shadows, I remember that calm voice telling me they knew how alone I was out here, and I keep the shotgun loaded by my bed. The detective said I handled it perfectly, that confronting them probably saved my life because they realized I wasn't an easy target. But I know the truth. I just got lucky that night. Lucky they had already gotten what they came for the first time. Lucky they decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Sometimes I still go out to that barn and look at that hidden compartment, now sealed with concrete, and wonder how many times they stood in there while I was sleeping just 50 yards away, completely oblivious to the danger I was in. The Whitmore cottage had been empty for 2 years when I found the listing online. September 2022, and I was scrolling through rental sites during my lunch break when this place popped up. Dirt cheap, middle of nowhere, Michigan, available immediately. Perfect timing since my Chicago lease was ending and I could take my graphic design work anywhere with decent internet. The photos showed weathered cedar siding, a wraparound porch with peeling white paint, and windows that looked original from the 1940s. Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly owner, met me at the property with a ring of keys that must have weighed 5 pounds. She walked me through the quirks, the water heater that needed a good kick sometimes, the upstairs bathroom faucet that dripped no matter what, and the family of raccoons that treated the garbage bins like their personal buffet. The nearest neighbor lived 4 miles down the main road, she said. But the isolation was part of the charm. After 3 weeks of settling in, I'd gotten used to the absolute silence at night, broken only by wind through the pines. That changed when the motion light started going off. First time was a Monday night around 2 a.m., and the sudden brightness through the kitchen window jolted me awake on the couch where I'd dozed off editing logos. The backyard lit up like a stadium, that harsh LED white illuminating maybe 30 feet of overgrown grass before hitting the wall of pine trees. I pressed my face against the cold window, scanning for whatever triggered it. The sensor supposedly had a 15-foot range from the back door. I'd checked the manual out of boredom my first week there. Could have been a deer, maybe those raccoons Mrs. Whitmore mentioned, or even a low-flying owl. After about 5 minutes, the light clicked off, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the black glass. I waited another 10 minutes, watching for movement, then dragged myself upstairs to my actual bed. The next night, same thing. 2:03 a.m. according to my phone when the light snapped on. This time I was ready, standing by the kitchen window before the glare could fully register. I'd even left the kitchen lights off so my eyes could adjust faster. The backyard looked exactly the same. Empty grass, dark trees, nothing moving. But here's what got me. The light stayed on for exactly 5 minutes again, then darkness. The manual said the timer was adjustable, anywhere from 30 seconds to 10 minutes. But I hadn't touched those settings. Whatever was triggering it was staying perfectly still once it activated, waiting for the timer to run out. Wednesday night I got smart and decided to check the yard before bed. I grabbed the flashlight from under the sink, one of those heavy metal ones that could double as a weapon, and did a sweep of the backyard. The grass was wet with dew, and my sneakers got soaked within seconds. Nothing seemed disturbed, no tracks in the softer dirt near the garden beds, no trash scattered around. Even checked the sensor itself, made sure no branches or spider webs were setting it off. That's when I found the handprints. Thursday morning, I was making coffee when I noticed them on the back door's glass panel. Muddy, definitely human, right at eye level like someone had been peering inside. 5 fingers clearly visible on the left print, the right one smeared but still obvious. My first thought was maybe a lost hiker, someone who'd gotten turned around in the woods and needed help. But why not knock? Why not call out? I grabbed paper towels and Windex, and when I went outside to clean the other side, I saw more prints on the siding next to the door. These were different though, cleaner, more deliberate, like someone had been steadying themselves against the wall. The mud was that thick, dark kind you get from deeper in the forest, not the sandy stuff from my yard. I took photos with my phone, thinking maybe I should send them to Mrs. Whitmore or even the sheriff's department. But what would I say? Someone touched my door. They'd probably laugh. Friday came with a storm warning. The weather app showed this massive system rolling in from Canada, promising heavy rain and possible power outages across northern Michigan. I spent the afternoon preparing, filling pots with water, charging all my devices, finding candles and matches. The cottage had a generator, but Mrs. Whitmore had been vague about whether it actually worked. Around 6 p.m., the sky turned this sick yellowish-gray color, and the wind started picking up something fierce. The trees were bending like I'd never seen, and the windows rattled in their frames. By 8 p.m., the rain was coming down sideways, hammering the roof so loud I couldn't even hear my music. I was in the kitchen making soup when the power died. Everything just stopped. The refrigerator's hum, the heating system's whisper, even that little LED clock on the microwave. The cottage plunged into complete darkness except for the occasional lightning flash that lit everything up like a strobe light. I felt my way to the drawer where I kept the flashlight, knocking over a glass in the process. It shattered on the floor, and I had to careful step around it to grab the light. The beam seemed pathetically weak against the total darkness, creating more shadows than it eliminated. I was heading to find those candles when I saw it. A flashlight beam outside, moving past the living room window. Then another one coming from the opposite direction, sweeping across the front porch. My first instinct was relief. Maybe it was the power company checking lines or neighbors making sure I was okay. But then I remembered. There were no neighbors close enough to walk here in this storm. The nearest house was 4 miles away, and the power company would have trucks, not people on foot with flashlights. I clicked off my light immediately and crouched below the window level. The beams kept moving, methodical and slow, like they were searching for something, or waiting for something. My phone had maybe 60% battery, no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell tower. I crawled on my knees to the kitchen, keeping below the window line, glass crunching under my palms from that broken cup. The flashlight beams were circling now, at least 3 of them, maybe 4. They weren't trying doors or windows yet, just circling like vultures. I could hear voices between thunder crashes. Male, definitely multiple people, but I couldn't make out words over the rain hammering the roof. The kitchen had a door to the basement, and I briefly considered hiding down there, but it was a stone cellar with no exit, basically a trap if they got inside. My car keys were on the hook by the front door, 15 feet from where someone's flashlight kept sweeping past the window. Even if I reached them, starting the car would announce exactly where I was, and they could easily block the narrow driveway with their bodies or vehicles. The back door handle rattled. Not like the wind was catching it. This was deliberate, someone testing if it was locked. Thank God I'd developed that paranoid city habit of always locking everything. The rattling stopped, then came back harder, more aggressive. Someone was really yanking on it now. I heard muffled cursing, then footsteps on the deck moving toward the kitchen window. I pressed myself against the cabinet, trying to become invisible in my own house. A face appeared in the window, just a silhouette backlit by lightning, but definitely looking inside. The beam of their flashlight swept the kitchen, passing right over where I was hiding. They must not have seen me because the light moved on and the face disappeared. But I heard something that made everything worse. A voice cleared during a brief lull in the rain, saying, "She's definitely in there." Saw her laptop on the couch. They'd been watching earlier, probably through the windows before the power went out. They knew I was alone, knew I was trapped, and they were deciding how to get inside. Then came the sound of breaking glass from upstairs. My bedroom window. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. Heavy footsteps on the floor above me moving toward the stairs. I had seconds to decide. The cottage had an old coal chute in the basement, sealed from the outside but accessible from inside. Mrs. Whitmore had mentioned it during the tour, said her grandfather used to slide coal down there in the winters. It led to a metal door hidden behind overgrown bushes on the side of the house. I grabbed my phone and car keys, abandoning everything else, and slipped through the basement door just as I heard boots on the main stairs. The basement was pitch black and smelled like wet stone and mold. I used my phone's light for 1 second to spot the coal chute, a narrow metal tunnel barely wide enough for a person. The covering panel came off with a screech that seemed impossibly loud, but the storm covered it. I could hear them ransacking the kitchen above, drawers being yanked open, furniture being shoved around. I squeezed into the chute head first, phone clenched between my teeth for light, pushing with my feet against the smooth metal. Cobwebs stuck to my face and hair, and something with too many legs scurried across my neck. The chute was longer than I expected, maybe 8 feet of claustrophobic metal tube that reeked of decades-old coal dust. Behind me, I heard the basement door slam open and footsteps on the wooden stairs. "Check everywhere," someone barked. "She didn't just vanish." My feet hit the exterior door. Rusty, stuck, probably hadn't been opened in years. I kicked hard once, twice, and on the third try it burst open into the storm. Rain immediately soaked me as I tumbled out into the bushes, branches scratching my face and arms. The flashlight beams were still visible through the windows, moving through the house like searchlights. I stayed low, crawling through mud and wet leaves toward my car. The keys were slippery in my shaking fingers, and I had to try 3 times to get them in the ignition. The engine turned over just as I saw a flashlight beam swing toward the driveway. I floored it in reverse, not even looking where I was going, just needing to get away from that cottage. The car fishtailed in the mud, tires spinning, and for one horrible second I thought I was stuck. Then the treads caught gravel and I shot backward onto the main road. In my rearview mirror, I saw 2 figures running down the driveway, their flashlights bouncing wildly. One raised something to his shoulder. I didn't wait to find out what. I cranked the wheel, shifted to drive, and accelerated into the storm. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the rain, and I was driving almost blind, just following the yellow center line when lightning revealed it. My phone, miraculously still working despite being soaked, finally found 1 bar of signal about 3 miles from the cottage. I called 911 while driving, probably sounding completely insane as I tried to explain about the men breaking into the cottage. The dispatcher kept asking me to slow down, to repeat the address, but I didn't stop driving until I reached the gas station at the highway junction 15 miles away. The bright fluorescent lights felt like salvation. The sheriff's department sent 2 units to the cottage. They found the broken window, the forced basement door, muddy boot prints throughout the house, and my laptop smashed on the living room floor. But whoever those men were, they were gone. The deputies found tire tracks from at least 2 vehicles parked in the woods behind the property and a collection of tools left behind. Crowbars, rope, duct tape. Things that made the deputies exchange dark looks. They never caught anyone. I gave descriptions, but they were basically useless. White males, average height, dark clothing. Could have been anyone. Mrs. Whitmore was horrified when I called her the next day. She refunded everything and offered to put me up in a hotel, but I was already back in Chicago by then, crashing on a friend's couch. She had the cottage boarded up and put security cameras everywhere, but as far as I know, she never rented it again. I still think about those nights sometimes, about how long they must have been watching me before they decided to make their move. The motion light starting exactly at 2 a.m., staying on for exactly 5 minutes. They were training me to dismiss it, to assume it was just animals. The really sick part is that if the storm hadn't knocked out the power, if I hadn't seen their flashlights, I would have gone to bed that Friday night completely unaware that they were coming for me. I'd been saving for years to buy my own piece of land, something far from city noise where I could actually see stars at night. 8 months ago, after my divorce papers were signed, and my life in Denver felt like it belonged to someone else, I found 10 acres in rural Montana with a farmhouse that needed work but had good bones. My accounting job had let me work remote since the pandemic, so there was nothing keeping me in the city anymore. Just me and Baxter, my golden retriever, loading up a U-Haul in late spring and driving toward what I hoped would be a fresh start. Property came with rolling hills, a creek that ran through the back portion, and more space than I knew what to do with. First few weeks were perfect, fixing up the house, planning where my vegetable garden would go, watching Baxter run around like he'd discovered paradise. My neighbor started watching me from day one. Harold Brennan owned the farm next door, probably 200 acres of wheat and corn that stretched beyond what I could see from my porch. 70-something years old, face weathered like cracked leather, always wearing these ancient overalls with stains that had become part of the fabric. His fence ran along our property line, just regular wire fencing with wooden posts every 8 feet or so. Every single morning when I'd step outside with my coffee, he'd already be there, standing at that fence with his hands resting on the posts, staring directly at my house. I tried being friendly at first, gave him a wave and a smile whenever I saw him out there. He never waved back, never acknowledged me at all, just kept watching with this blank expression that made me uncomfortable enough to go back inside. Figured he was probably one of those old farmers who didn't appreciate city folks buying up rural land. About 3 weeks after moving in, things started getting weird. I'd left my pruning shears on the back deck after working in the garden all afternoon, too tired to put them away properly. Next morning, they weren't there. I searched everywhere, thinking maybe Baxter had carried them off somewhere, though he'd never shown interest in garden tools before. 2 days later, I spotted them placed perfectly parallel to the fence line on Harold's side, lined up neat as you please about 20 feet from where I'd left them. Strange thing was, they were cleaned and oiled, looking better than when I'd bought them. I walked over to retrieve them, and that's when I saw Harold standing in his field about 50 yards away, watching me pick them up. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there like a scarecrow with eyes. I grabbed my shears and hurried back to my house, telling myself the wind must have blown them over somehow, even though there hadn't been any storms. A few days passed without incident, and I'd almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. Then my laundry started disappearing. I'd hung sheets and some work clothes on the line behind my house on a Monday morning. Perfect drying weather with a steady breeze. Went inside to make lunch and do some remote work. Came back out around 3 to find half my laundry missing. Not blown away, not on the ground, just gone. My favorite flannel shirt, a pair of jeans, and one pillowcase had vanished, while everything else hung exactly where I'd left it. I walked the property for an hour, checking the tree line, looking in ditches, even wondering if Baxter had somehow pulled them down. Nothing. Next morning, there they were, folded into perfect squares and stacked on a fence post on Harold's side of the property line. My flannel on top, jeans in the middle, pillowcase on the bottom. Each piece had been washed again and pressed with military precision. Baxter's collar was the breaking point. He wore this thick leather collar with brass studs that I'd bought him for his 5th birthday. Nothing fancy, but it had his name engraved on a metal plate along with my phone number. One evening, I let him out for his before-bed bathroom break like always. He came back 15 minutes later, scratching at the door, completely normal except his collar was gone. I grabbed a flashlight and searched the yard, thinking maybe it had gotten caught on something and slipped off. Baxter stayed close to me, which was unusual. Normally he'd be bouncing around, excited about a nighttime adventure. We searched for an hour with no luck. I kept him inside that night, double-checked all the locks and barely slept. Sure enough, next morning when I looked out my kitchen window, there was Baxter's collar hanging from a nail on Harold's fence post, polished until the brass studs gleamed like new. But here's what really made my skin prickle. Attached to it was a new tag, handmade from what looked like hammered tin, with the word "visiting" etched into it in shaky letters. I'd had enough. I marched straight across my property to the fence line, Baxter reluctantly following behind me, whimpering in a way I'd never heard before. Harold was already there, of course, standing in his usual spot like he'd been waiting for me. Up close, I could see his eyes were this pale, watery blue, like looking through old glass. His fingernails were impossibly clean for a farmer, filed down to perfect half-moons. "Mr. Brennan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need my dog's collar back, and I need you to stop taking my things." He smiled then, the first time I'd seen any expression on his face. His teeth were small and evenly spaced, like baby teeth that never fell out. "But you left them for me," he said, his voice higher than I expected, almost sing-song. "Right there where I could reach them. Gifts for a good neighbor." His fingers traced the wire fence between us, and I noticed he'd tied tiny strips of fabric to various points along it, pieces I recognized from clothes I'd thrown away weeks ago, before any of this started. I took a step back, pulling Baxter with me. "I never left anything for you, Mr. Brennan. You've been coming onto my property and taking my belongings. That's theft. If it happens again, I'm calling the sheriff." Harold's smile widened, and he leaned closer to the fence, close enough that I could smell him. Not unpleasant, but wrong somehow, like fresh soap mixed with formaldehyde. "Sheriff Thompson? He understands neighborly traditions. His father did too, and his father before that. The family that lived in your house before, the Carvers, they understood. Mrs. Carver left me her jewelry box when she moved, right there by the fence, wrapped in newspaper. Such a thoughtful woman." He reached into his overall pocket and pulled out a small silver locket, letting it spin in the morning sun. "Would you like to see her picture inside? She had hair just like yours before it went gray." My stomach turned. The Carvers had left suddenly, according to the real estate agent. Something about a family emergency back east. Now I wondered if that was true. Harold continued talking, his voice maintaining that unsettling, cheerful tone. "Your house has been empty for 2 years before you came. I maintained things, kept the property nice, mowed around the fence line, picked up trash that blew in, made sure no animals nested under the porch. Good neighbors do that. And in return, good neighbors leave gifts, small tokens of appreciation. The Hendricksons before the Carvers. They left me their son's bicycle when they moved. Still have it in my barn. Oiled the chain every month for 15 years now." He pulled out a small notebook from another pocket, pages yellowed and covered with cramped handwriting. "I keep records, every gift, every date. You've been here 43 days. The pruning shears on day 19. The flannel shirt on day 26. Baxter's collar on day 42. All documented, all appreciated." He flipped through pages, and I caught glimpses of detailed entries going back years, each one describing items and dates in meticulous detail. Some entries had small drawings of the objects, sketched with disturbing accuracy. I grabbed Baxter's collar from the fence post and started backing away. "Stay away from my property, Mr. Brennan. I mean it." But he just kept talking like I hadn't spoken. The woman before the Carvers, Ms. Deborah, she was special. Left me her reading glasses after I fixed her mailbox. Still wear them sometimes when I read my records. Perfect prescription for my eyes, like they were meant for me. She understood that some people are meant to be caretakers, collectors of neighborhood history. He produced a pair of wire-rimmed glasses from his shirt pocket, perched them on his nose, and stared at me through them. "You'll understand soon. They all do eventually, or they leave. But their gifts stay with me. Always." That night, I installed motion sensor lights around my property and set up a camera system I ordered with overnight shipping. I deadbolted everything, even put a lock on Baxter's dog door. I called the sheriff's office, but the deputy who answered sounded bored when I explained the situation. Said Harold was harmless, just set in his ways, and maybe I should try being more neighborly. Suggested I could put up a taller fence if it bothered me that much. For 3 days, nothing happened. The motion sensor stayed quiet. The cameras showed nothing but deer and raccoons. I started to think maybe Harold had gotten the message. Then on Saturday morning, I woke up to find my entire garden rearranged. Every single plant had been dug up and replanted in perfectly straight rows, sorted by height. My tomatoes formed a gradient from shortest to tallest. The herbs were arranged alphabetically: basil, cilantro, oregano, rosemary, thyme. The soil around each plant was shaped into identical small mounds, and every leaf had been cleaned of dust or imperfections. But the worst part was the labels. Handmade wooden stakes next to each plant with the Latin names burned into them, along with the date and a number. When I checked my camera footage, it showed nothing. Just my garden normal at midnight, then at 6 a.m., completely reorganized. The 4 hours in between were static, like something had interfered with the signal. I found Harold at his fence an hour later, dirt under those impossibly clean fingernails, humming a tune I recognized but couldn't place. That was when I decided to leave. I called my sister in Colorado, told her I needed to visit for a while, didn't explain why. Started packing that afternoon, throwing clothes into suitcases without folding them, boxing up only the essentials. Baxter seemed to sense my urgency, staying glued to my side and growling whenever we passed a window facing Harold's property. Around sunset, while I was loading boxes into my car, I found a gift on my porch. A handmade wooden box, crafted with obvious skill, with "Farewell Neighbor" carved into the lid. Inside, arranged on velvet fabric, were all the items Harold had taken, plus things I hadn't even noticed were missing. A coffee mug I thought I'd broken, a bookmark from a library book, a button from my winter coat. Each item was labeled with a tiny tag showing the date it was gifted and returned. At the bottom of the box was a black and white photograph I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized it was me, sleeping in my bed, taken from inside my room. The date on the back was from 2 weeks before I'd installed the cameras. I threw the box in my car, grabbed Baxter, and left that night without looking back. I stayed with my sister for 3 months before finding a new place, a condo in a busy neighborhood where houses are 10 feet apart and everyone has Ring doorbells. Never went back to Montana to get the rest of my things. Hired a moving company to pack everything and put the property up for sale through a remote closing. The realtor called me a few weeks later, said Harold had been by several times asking for my forwarding address, claimed I'd left some gifts for him that he needed to collect. She didn't give it to him, thank God. The house sold to a young couple from California 2 months later. I've thought about warning them, but what would I say that wouldn't sound insane? Last week, I got a package with no return address. Inside was Harold's notebook, the one with all the records. The final entry was about me. Pages and pages of observations, sketches of my daily routines, notes about my habits. The very last line, written in red ink, said, "Good neighbors always return." I burned it in my sister's backyard, but sometimes I still dream about that fence, about Harold standing there in the morning sun, waiting patiently for gifts that were never meant for him. Baxter still won't go near property lines, and neither will I. I never thought accepting a job at a grain processing plant in rural Kansas would lead to the most disturbing months of my life. It was spring of 2018, and after losing my IT position in Philadelphia, the offer seemed like a fresh start. Decent pay, low cost of living, and honestly, I needed to get away from everything that reminded me of my ex-fiancée. The town of Millbrook had maybe 800 residents on a good day, the kind of place where the main street still had those old-fashioned lamp posts and every building looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. I rented a farmhouse about 3 miles outside town, this yellow 2-story place with peeling paint and a wraparound porch that creaked whenever the wind picked up. The isolation felt therapeutic at first. Just me, endless cornfields, and the kind of quiet that made your ears ring at night. About 2 weeks after settling in, my old Ford Explorer started making this grinding noise whenever I turned left, the kind of sound that makes you wince and know your wallet's about to take a hit. The locals at the diner told me there was only one mechanic in town, a guy named Eugene who ran a shop called Gene's Auto Care on the south end of Main Street. When I pulled up to the place that first time, I noticed the lot was absolutely packed with vehicles. Had to be at least 30 cars and trucks crammed into every available space, some looking like they'd been sitting there for years with weeds growing up through the wheel wells. The garage itself was this corrugated metal building, painted forest green, with 2 bay doors and an office attached to the side that had those old Venetian blinds hanging crooked in the window. Eugene turned out to be this tall, thin guy in his 60s, with these unusually long fingers and eyes so pale blue, they almost looked white in certain light. He walked with this strange rolling gait, like one leg was slightly longer than the other, and when he smiled, he only ever showed his bottom teeth. The conversation about my Explorer went smooth enough. Eugene diagnosed the problem as a worn CV joint, said he could have it fixed in 3 days for about $400, which seemed fair. What struck me as odd was how he kept writing in this little leather notebook while we talked, filling entire pages with cramped handwriting that I couldn't read from where I stood. He'd ask me these random questions between discussing the repair. Where exactly did I live? Was I married? Did I have family visiting soon? How long was my contract at the plant? I figured small-town curiosity. Maybe he was just starved for new conversation after dealing with the same few hundred people for decades. But when I went to leave my keys, he did this thing where he held them up to the fluorescent light in the garage, studying them like they were some kind of artifact, running his thumb along each key's edge before pocketing them with this satisfied nod. I asked him about all the cars in the lot, while he wrote up my invoice, mentioned how busy he must be with that many repairs backing up. Eugene's whole demeanor shifted. His shoulders tensed and he started tapping his pen against the counter in this rapid, agitated rhythm. He said people in Millbrook were just slow about picking things up, that farming season kept folks busy. Some people had 2 or 3 vehicles and weren't in a rush. But there was this pickup truck right by the entrance, a newer Silverado with custom rims and a lift kit, the kind of truck someone put serious money into, and it had a thick layer of dust and bird droppings covering the windshield. I pointed it out, said whoever owned that must really not need it back, and Eugene just stared at me for maybe 10 seconds without blinking before saying the owner was out of state temporarily. The way he said temporarily made it sound like he was tasting something bitter. The 3 days without my car meant bumming rides from a coworker named Carl who lived in town. On the second day, I mentioned Eugene's shop during lunch break, how it seemed like half the county had their vehicles parked there. Carl got this look on his face like I'd just asked about his medical history. Uncomfortable, almost guilty. He said Eugene did good work, fair prices, never had complaints, then immediately changed the subject to the weather forecast. That evening at the diner, I brought it up with the waitress, Nancy, this chatty woman in her 40s who usually had opinions about everything. When I mentioned the abandoned cars, she suddenly remembered she needed to check on another table, even though the place was nearly empty. The cook, visible through the serving window, actually stopped what he was doing to look at me, just stood there holding his spatula until Nancy whispered something to him. On day 3, I walked to Gene's Auto Care to pick up my Explorer, arriving about 20 minutes before closing time. The sun was setting behind the building, casting these long shadows across the lot, and I noticed something that made me stop in the middle of the sidewalk. There were fewer cars than before, at least 5 or 6 were gone, but in their place were different vehicles I hadn't seen during my first visit. A blue minivan with those stick figure family decals, a Jeep Wrangler with college stickers on the back window, a pristine classic Mustang that someone had clearly babied. Eugene was in the office when I walked in, bent over that same leather notebook, writing so intently he didn't hear the bell above the door. When I cleared my throat, he slammed the notebook shut and shoved it into a drawer like I'd caught him doing something inappropriate. My Explorer was ready, running smooth, and the price was exactly what he'd quoted. But when he handed me the keys, his fingers lingered on them just a second too long, and he asked if I'd be needing any regular maintenance soon. Oil changes, tire rotations, anything at all. That night, I woke up around 2 in the morning because my bedroom was flooded with light. Not the soft glow of moonlight, but harsh white beams cutting through my curtains. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds to see a vehicle parked at the end of my long gravel driveway, headlights aimed directly at my house. It was too far to make out details, but it looked like a sedan, just sitting there with the engine running. I could see exhaust drifting up in the cold air. I stood there for maybe 15 minutes waiting for something to happen, for someone to get out or drive away, but it just sat there like it was watching. Finally, I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the moment I picked it up, the car reversed slowly down the road and disappeared. The next morning I found deep tire tracks in the gravel and a cigarette butt near where the car had been parked, the filter stained with what looked like motor oil. 2 nights later, it happened again, except this time there were 2 vehicles, that same sedan and what appeared to be a pickup truck. They parked parallel to each other, blocking my entire driveway, engines running, headlights creating a wall of light that lit up my entire property. I could make out silhouettes in both vehicles, just sitting there, not moving, not talking on phones, just sitting and watching my house. This time I did call the sheriff's department, but the dispatcher sounded weird when I gave my address, like she was writing something down beyond just the information I was providing. She said a deputy would come by when available, but by the time Sheriff Walton showed up 40 minutes later, the vehicles were long gone. Walton, this heavy-set guy with a gray mustache who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, barely glanced at the tire tracks and told me it was probably just kids fooling around, maybe some of the high schoolers playing pranks on the new guy in town. When I mentioned the cars might have come from Eugene's lot, his whole expression hardened, and he said I should be careful about making accusations without proof, that Eugene was a respected member of the community who'd been here longer than I'd been alive. The next afternoon, I decided to do something that, in retrospect, was incredibly stupid but felt necessary at the time. I drove past Eugene's shop around noon when I knew he'd be at lunch. He always closed from 12 to 1, regular as clockwork according to Carl. I parked across the street and walked through the lot, taking pictures of license plates with my phone, trying to see if any of these vehicles matched what I'd seen at night. That's when I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Several of the cars had personal items still inside. A baby's car seat in the minivan, shopping bags in the back of a sedan, a purse sitting on the passenger seat of a small hatchback. One truck had mail scattered on the dashboard, and I could read the address on one envelope through the windshield. It was for a house in Arkansas, almost 600 miles away. I was photographing the envelope when I heard Eugene's voice behind me, asking what I thought I was doing on his property. He'd appeared without making a sound, standing maybe 10 feet away, holding a tire iron loose at his side. His pale eyes weren't angry, just focused on me with this intense concentration, like he was memorizing every detail of my face. I made up some story about thinking I'd seen my coworker's car and wanting to leave a note, but Eugene just kept staring, not blinking, that tire iron swaying slightly in his grip. He told me his customers valued their privacy, that snooping around other people's property was a good way to make enemies in a small town, that outsiders who didn't respect the way things worked in Millbrook tended to have unfortunate luck. The way he said unfortunate luck while glancing at my Explorer made it clear this wasn't advice but a threat. As I walked back to my car, he followed at a distance, and when I looked in my rearview mirror after driving away, he was still standing in the street, watching. That evening, I found a note under my windshield wiper. Not a threat, just a business card for Jean's Auto Care, with a handwritten message on the back that said, "Regular maintenance prevents unexpected breakdowns." When I looked closer at the card, I realized the handwriting was different from Eugene's, more feminine, and there was a small smudge at the bottom that looked like dried blood. That night changed everything. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of my Explorer's engine starting in the driveway. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd started keeping by my bed and ran outside, but the car was already moving, driving itself down my driveway with no one in the driver's seat, at least no one I could see. Then I realized there was someone in there, hunched down below the dashboard, and as the car turned onto the main road, I caught a glimpse of Eugene's pale eyes in the driver's side mirror, looking right at me. I called 911 immediately, but the same dispatcher from before answered, and when I frantically explained my car had been stolen, she said she'd send someone when available and hung up before I could give details. No one came. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my porch with that bat, watching the empty road, and at exactly 6 in the morning, my Explorer came rolling back up the driveway, parked in the exact same spot, keys in the ignition, like nothing had happened. The odometer showed an extra 47 miles. Inside the car, I found things that weren't mine. A receipt from a gas station 2 towns over, time-stamped at 4:17 a.m., a muddy work boot in the back seat that wasn't my size, and worst of all, my registration and insurance papers were gone, replaced with photocopies. The originals, I realized with growing dread, meant Eugene now had all my personal information. My full name, my previous address in Philadelphia, even my social security number from the insurance form. I packed everything I could fit in 2 suitcases that morning, left a resignation letter under the plant manager's door, and drove straight through to my brother's place in Texas, only stopping for gas and checking my mirrors constantly. I never went back for the rest of my things, just had my brother hire movers a month later. The moving company called to say the house was empty when they arrived. Not just my belongings gone, but cleaned out completely, like no one had ever lived there. They also mentioned something odd. There were 7 vehicles parked in the field behind the house, all with their keys in the ignitions, engines cold, and personal items still inside. My Explorer still runs, but sometimes when I start it on cold mornings, I catch a whiff of cigarette smoke and motor oil that wasn't there before, and I wonder what those 47 miles were really about. Last summer, I inherited my great-aunt Margaret's house in a small farming village, about 4 hours north of where I lived. I'd only met her twice as a kid, but apparently I was her only living relative who bothered to send Christmas cards. The place sat empty for 6 months after she passed while the estate got sorted out, and when the keys finally arrived in the mail, I figured why not give rural life a shot. My graphic design work was all remote anyway, and city rent was eating up most of my income. The house needed work, sure, but it had good bones. A 2-story farmhouse with yellow shutters and a wraparound porch that overlooked endless cornfields. I packed up my apartment, loaded everything into a U-Haul, and drove out there on a humid Friday afternoon in early August, ready for what I thought would be a peaceful new chapter. The first person I met was Mrs. Henley from next door, a woman in her 70s with steel gray hair pulled back so tight it stretched her face. She was watering her tomatoes when I pulled up, and she just stood there holding the hose, letting water pool around her plants while she stared at me unloading boxes. When I waved and called out a friendly hello, she didn't wave back, just gave this slow nod and said, "You're Margaret's kin, then." Not a question, just a flat statement. I walked over to introduce myself properly, but she'd already turned her back and gone inside, leaving her hose running in the garden. That evening, I noticed her curtains move at least a dozen times while I unpacked. Every time I looked up from carrying a box, there she was, peeking through the lace. I told myself she was just curious about the new neighbor, that small towns were always like this with newcomers. Saturday morning, I walked into town to grab supplies from the hardware store. The house needed new locks, some paint, basic repair stuff. The main road had maybe 6 shops total: a general store, the hardware place, a diner called Ruth's, a post office, a church, and a boarded-up antique shop. Streets were weirdly empty for a Saturday, but I could feel eyes on me from every window I passed. At the hardware store, the owner, Mr. Dalton, knew exactly who I was before I opened my mouth. "Margaret's grandniece from the city," he said, not smiling, while 2 other customers stopped their conversation mid-sentence to turn and stare. He rang up my items in complete silence, and when I tried to make small talk about the weather, he just grunted. The other customers, 2 men in overalls, followed me around the store, always staying 2 aisles over but clearly watching. When I paid, Mr. Dalton put my change on the counter instead of in my hand, like he didn't want to touch me. The diner was worse. I stopped in for coffee and a sandwich, thinking maybe I could chat with some locals, get a feel for the place. The moment I walked through the door, every conversation died. There were maybe 15 people in there, and they all turned to look at me in perfect unison, like they'd rehearsed it. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a name tag reading Diane, took forever to come to my table, and when she finally did, she stood as far away as possible while taking my order. Nobody resumed talking the entire time I sat there. They just ate in silence, occasionally glancing at me, then at each other, these meaningful looks I couldn't read. My sandwich came out wrong. I'd ordered turkey, got ham instead, but I didn't dare complain. I left a 20 for a $12 bill and basically ran out of there. As soon as the door closed behind me, I heard the conversation start up again, urgent and hushed. Sunday was when things got genuinely weird. I woke up around 7 to find at least 8 people standing at the edge of my property just watching the house. They weren't together, spread out along the fence line, some by the road, one couple near the old oak tree. When I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, they didn't scatter or look embarrassed like normal people caught staring would. They just kept watching. I waved awkwardly, and a few gave these synchronized nods like they'd practiced it. After about 20 minutes, they all left at the exact same time, walking away in different directions without a word to each other. I spent the rest of the morning inside, blinds drawn, trying to convince myself this was just small-town weirdness. But when I peeked out around noon, there were different people doing the same thing, standing at the property line, perfectly still, just watching. That afternoon, I'd had enough of hiding indoors and decided to work on the garden. Aunt Margaret's vegetables had gone wild, and focusing on pulling weeds felt like something normal, something that might make me feel less like I was losing my mind. I was maybe an hour into it when I realized how quiet everything was. No birds, no insects. Even the wind had stopped. Then I heard breathing, slow, deliberate breathing from the other side of the hedge that separated my yard from the road. I stood up slowly, and through the gaps in the bushes, I could see at least 4 people standing there, pressed right up against the hedge. They had to know I could hear them, see them, but they didn't move. One of them, a young guy maybe my age with pale blue eyes, was looking straight at me through the leaves. We made eye contact for what felt like forever before I broke and ran back inside. From the kitchen window, I watched them stay there for another hour before dispersing. Monday morning, I woke up to find my garbage cans had been gone through. Not by animals, everything was too neat for that. My mail had been carefully opened and resealed, bills and junk mail arranged in a perfect stack on the porch. But the worst part was the photographs. Someone had taken pictures of me through my windows, dozens of them printed and slipped under my door. Pictures of me cooking dinner, brushing my teeth, sleeping on the couch Saturday afternoon. In each photo, you could see the reflection in the window glass, and there were multiple faces in every shot. They'd been taking turns, passing the camera around, everyone getting their chance to document me. My car had been moved too, just a few feet, but the driver's seat was adjusted wrong and the radio station had been changed. They wanted me to know they'd been inside it. I tried calling the police, but the landline was dead. Not cut, just dead. My cell phone had no signal, which was supposedly normal for the area according to the rental listing, but now felt intentional. I drove to the police station in the next town over, about 40 minutes away, but the officer there, Sheriff Briggs, just gave me this tired look when I explained what was happening. "Those folks in Millfield keep to themselves," he said, tapping his pen on the desk. "They don't much care for outsiders, but they're harmless. Give it time, they'll warm up to you." He wouldn't even look at the photographs, just pushed them back across the desk. When I insisted something was really wrong, he leaned back and said, "Your Aunt Margaret lived there for 43 years without a single incident. Maybe you're just not trying hard enough to fit in." The way he said it, the way his expression changed, I realized he knew exactly what was happening and didn't care. Or maybe he couldn't do anything about it. When I got back from the police station that evening, every single light in my house was on. Every lamp, every overhead fixture, even the little light above the stove. The front door was still locked, windows still shut, but somehow they'd gotten in. Nothing was stolen or broken, but everything had been touched. My clothes were refolded differently in the drawers. The books on my shelves were arranged by color instead of by author. The food in my fridge had been reorganized, labels all facing perfectly forward. Even my toothbrush had been moved to the opposite side of the sink. But the detail that made me pack my bags right then was the note on my bed, written in shaky handwriting. "Margaret knew her place. Learn yours." I threw whatever I could grab into 2 suitcases and headed straight for my car. I didn't care about the house anymore, about the inheritance, about any of it. I just needed to leave. The car started fine, but when I got to the end of my driveway, the engine died. I tried again. It would start, drive about 10 feet, then die. I popped the hood but couldn't see anything obviously wrong. That's when I noticed them coming out of their houses. All of them, every neighbor, maybe 30 people total. They walked slowly toward my car, forming a circle around it. Nobody said anything. They just stood there watching me try the ignition over and over. Mrs. Henley came closest, tapping on my window with one gnarled finger. When I finally rolled it down an inch, she said, "Having car trouble, dear? What a shame. Gets dark early this time of year." The others murmured agreement, this low humming sound that made my teeth ache. I locked the doors and kept trying the engine, but it wouldn't catch anymore. They stood there until well after sunset, just watching, before finally wandering back to their homes one by one. I spent that night barricaded in the bedroom, a kitchen knife on the nightstand, every piece of furniture I could move pushed against the door. Around 3 in the morning, I heard them in the house, footsteps on the stairs, whispers in the hallway, doorknobs turning slowly. They never tried to force their way into the bedroom. They just wanted me to know they were there. At dawn, I heard car doors slamming outside. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, I saw 4 of my neighbors' trucks parked across my driveway, blocking any chance of escape. But there was also another car, a rental with out-of-state plates. A woman about my age was getting out, looking confused. That's when I found the letter that had been slipped under the bedroom door during the night. It was the deed to the house, already signed over to someone named Jennifer Reeves, dated a week before I'd even arrived. The letter explained that the town council had sold the property after Margaret died, that I was trespassing, and that the new owner would be taking possession immediately. I called out from the window to the woman with the rental car, told her to run, that these people were dangerous. But she just looked up at me, confused. And then Mrs. Henley appeared beside her with the biggest smile I'd seen from any of them. "Jennifer, dear, we're so glad you're finally here. Don't mind her. She's been squatting in your house, poor thing. Mental troubles, you understand. We've been keeping an eye on her for you." The other neighbors came out, shaking Jennifer's hand, welcoming her like she was family. One of them, that same young man with the pale eyes, looked up at me and mouthed the words, "Wrong bloodline." That's when it clicked. Margaret had never mentioned her family because she wasn't really from here either. She was someone they'd allowed to stay, maybe trapped the same way. The real inheritance was never the house. It was whatever agreement she'd made with them to be left alone. Within an hour, the sheriff arrived with an eviction notice. I had 20 minutes to grab my already packed bags and leave. As I drove away, I saw them in my rearview mirror, all standing in a line across the road, making sure I was really going. Jennifer was already on the porch with Mrs. Henley, both of them waving. I found out later that Jennifer Reeves was Mrs. Henley's niece from 2 states over. The house had always belonged to them. They just needed Margaret's bloodline to end before they could reclaim it. Dad lost his job at the accounting firm in May 2017, and by July we were packing our entire life into a U-Haul headed for rural Wisconsin. My parents sold it as a temporary adventure, while Dad figured out his next career move. But I knew better. We were broke, and this farmhouse rental was all we could afford. I was 16, furious about leaving my friends behind for some forgotten corner of America, where the nearest neighbor was 2 miles away and internet barely existed. The property sprawled across 40 acres of tangled grass and forgotten fence posts, complete with a barn that probably hadn't housed livestock since the Nixon administration, and this peculiar shed about 50 yards from the main house, secured with the industrial-grade padlock that gleamed against the weathered wood, like it had been installed yesterday. Mr. A. Kruger, the landlord, made a big production about that shed during our first walkthrough, his watery blue eyes darting between us and the structure while he twisted his wedding ring around his finger. He claimed it stored hazardous farming equipment from his father's era, rusted machinery, pesticide containers from the 70s, stuff that could seriously hurt us if we went poking around. The way he repeated himself 3 times, voice getting higher with each warning, made Mom grab both Katie and me by the shoulders and swear us to stay away. But something about his story felt rehearsed, especially when he mentioned the reinforced walls and special ventilation system his father had installed, details that seemed oddly specific for a storage shed full of abandoned junk. The first 2 weeks passed without incident, just the usual adjustment to country living, the oppressive silence at night, the well water that tasted like pennies, and the way darkness swallowed everything beyond our porch light. Then came the scratching. It started on a humid Sunday night in late July, this rhythmic scraping that drifted through my bedroom window like fingernails dragging across wood. At first I blamed the ancient oak tree beside the house, its branches probably rubbing against the siding. But when I actually listened, the sound was coming from the wrong direction, from somewhere near the back of the property. Katie heard it too. She padded into my room around midnight, clutching her stuffed rabbit, asking if raccoons could make noises that sounded like someone trying to write messages on walls. By the 4th night of scratching, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to investigate with my phone flashlight after my parents went to bed. The moonlight turned the overgrown yard into a maze of shadows, and every step through the tall grass sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. As I got closer to the shed, the scratching grew more distinct, more deliberate. Not random animal movements, but patterns, almost like someone was keeping count of something on the walls. The padlock hung exactly as it always did, untouched and secure. But when I circled around to the back, I noticed gaps between some of the older boards where the wood had warped over time. My phone's light could barely penetrate the darkness inside, but what I saw made me stumble backward into the wet grass. Through the narrow gap, illuminated by my phone's weak beam, I could make out what looked like a makeshift living space. Not farming equipment, not chemical containers, but blankets folded with military precision against one wall. Plastic water bottles stood in perfect rows along a wooden shelf that someone had built into the corner, and beside them sat neat stacks of what appeared to be canned goods, their labels too faded to read in the dim light. The scratching had stopped the moment my light hit the interior, replaced by a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond where my light could reach, came the slow, measured sound of breathing, not panicked or surprised, but calm, controlled, like someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. I ran back to the house faster than I'd ever moved in my life, crashing through the screen door and waking everyone with my noise. Dad found me hyperventilating in the kitchen, trying to explain what I'd seen while Mom held Katie, who had started crying from all the commotion. When I finally got the words out, someone was living in the shed, had been living there this whole time. Dad's face went from annoyed to alert in seconds. He grabbed his baseball bat and the big mag light from under the sink, telling Mom to lock the doors behind him. But when we reached the shed together, the padlock was still there, still locked, still impossible to open without the key that Mr. Kruger had explicitly told us he'd kept for insurance reasons. Dad shined his flashlight through the same gap I'd looked through, and I watched his knuckles go white around the bat handle as he took in the scene inside. He tried calling Mr. Kruger right there in the dark, but it went straight to voicemail. All 6 times he called. We spent the rest of the night huddled in my parents' bedroom with chairs wedged under the doorknobs, Dad sitting by the window with his bat while Mom called the sheriff's department. The deputy who showed up around dawn, a young guy named Officer Riley, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, became very interested when we showed him the gap and what was visible inside. He made a call to his supervisor, then another to someone else, his voice dropping to a whisper as he walked away from us. Within an hour, 3 more patrol cars had arrived, along with an unmarked van that parked directly in front of the shed. The officers wouldn't let us get close, forming a barrier while someone with bolt cutters approached the padlock, but we could see everything from the kitchen window. When they finally got the door open, 2 officers entered with their hands on their weapons, only to emerge moments later supporting a woman between them, thin, maybe mid-30s, with tangled hair and clothes that might have once been office attire. She wasn't fighting them, wasn't screaming or crying, just walking with this eerie composure while staring directly at our house, her lips moving like she was counting something under her breath. The detective who questioned us later, Detective Morrison, kept asking if we'd noticed anything unusual about Mr. Kruger during our interactions, if he'd mentioned any family members or seemed nervous about specific dates. That's when the horrible picture started forming in my mind, piece by piece, like one of those puzzles where you don't know what image you're making until it's almost complete. The woman was Mr. Kruger's daughter, had been reported missing from a psychiatric facility in Madison 8 months ago, after what the detective carefully called an incident at her workplace, where she'd locked her co-workers in a conference room and set fire to the building's main exit. Mr. Kruger had been hiding her here, bringing her food and water at night when no tenants were around, but our rental had complicated things since he couldn't risk us seeing him visit the shed. The scratching, the detective explained while Mom poured him coffee with shaking hands, was her way of keeping track of days, making marks on the inside walls with a piece of metal she'd pried loose from the shelving. They found hundreds of these marks, organized into groups of 7, covering every reachable surface like some desperate calendar. But the detail that still wakes me up at night, the thing that made Dad pack us up that same afternoon, despite having 2 months left on our lease, was what they found written in the condensation on those water bottles. The same message on each one, written with a fingertip in perfect handwriting. Family coming July 15th. We had moved in on July 15th, and she'd been watching us through those gaps in the boards ever since, studying our routines, learning our schedules, waiting for something even the detective couldn't quite explain. Mr. Kruger was arrested that afternoon at his apartment in Madison, and the detective called us a week later with updates while we stayed at a motel. The woman, her name was Angela, had been convinced that whatever family moved into the farmhouse was actually her own family, replaced by imposters, and she'd been documenting our movements to find proof of the deception. They found notebooks in the shed filled with observations, what time Dad left for job interviews, which bedroom window Katie's nightlight shone through, how many minutes Mom spent watering the garden each morning. The most disturbing entry, dated 3 days before I discovered her, simply read, "The boy knows," He'll help me get back inside my real home soon. Mr. Kruger had been planning to move her to another property before we discovered the truth. But our early arrival that night had disrupted everything. We never went back to the farmhouse, not even to get the rest of our belongings. Dad hired a moving company to pack everything while we waited in the truck down the road. The company found new tenants within a month, according to the local news, but they only lasted 6 weeks before breaking their lease. Nobody would say why exactly, but I found a post on a local Facebook group from the wife, asking if anyone else had experienced scratching sounds coming from inside their walls, and whether it was normal for shed padlocks to be found unlocked in the morning when they were definitely secured the night before. The property's been empty ever since, and every time I drive past that town on the interstate, I think about those neat rows of water bottles, that careful handwriting in the condensation, and wonder if Angela really went back to the psychiatric facility like they said, or if she simply found a better hiding spot, waiting for the next family to arrive. It was during a stretch when I had taken some time off college and stayed with my uncle on his farm. He needed help fixing fences, moving hay, and just keeping the place in order, and I figured the quiet would do me good. The farm sat a little outside a small town, surrounded by acres of open fields and a cluster of old buildings that hadn't been touched in years. Among them stood a large weathered barn, its roof sagging slightly, with boards so gray they looked like driftwood. My uncle never went near it, always saying it was too much trouble to fix. One afternoon while hauling feed, I caught a flicker of movement in the loft window of that barn. It wasn't just a shadow, it was distinct, as if someone had leaned slightly to the side and then pulled back. At first I thought of raccoons or maybe a stray cat. The glass panes up there were dusty, some cracked, and for a moment I convinced myself it had just been the way the sun hit. But the feeling of being observed lingered longer than I cared to admit. As the days went on, little things started to nag at me. A hammer I'd left by the shed disappeared, then a coil of rope. My uncle chalked it up to me misplacing them, which I considered too until a bag of bread from the kitchen was gone the next morning. He was more irritated than worried, muttering about mice or birds, but I knew birds don't carry off whole loaves. I kept thinking back to that loft window and how it had seemed just slightly too deliberate. I decided to keep an eye on the barn whenever I had chores outside. The place had a presence that grew heavier the longer I watched it, like the silence around it wasn't natural. Even the dogs avoided it, circling wide whenever they ran the property. That got to me more than anything else, because those dogs usually stuck their noses into every corner. Something about that loft window felt occupied, and the thought that a stranger could be living right under our noses made the air around the farm feel tense. One evening, I walked past the barn while the light was fading, that in-between time when everything looks uncertain. I caught a faint sound, almost like a creak from inside, the kind that comes when someone shifts their weight on an old wooden floorboard. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the loft window, waiting for that same flicker I had seen before. Nothing moved, but the silence that followed felt thick, like the whole barn was holding its breath. I remember swallowing hard, forcing myself to turn away, but I kept glancing back as I walked. The next morning, my uncle complained that a sack of potatoes he'd kept in the pantry had vanished. He locked the kitchen door that night, something he never did in all the years I'd known him. Still, the unease grew. I started checking locks twice, sometimes 3 times, and leaving a flashlight by the bed. It was the kind of tension where you keep telling yourself you're being silly, but at the same time you're bracing for something to happen. By the end of the week, it did. I woke up to the dogs barking like mad outside, their voices sharp and frantic, nothing like their usual warning growls. Grabbing the flashlight, I stepped out onto the back porch. The beam of light swept across the yard, catching on wet patches of earth from the rain earlier that day. And that's when I saw them. Muddy boot prints pressed deep into the ground, leading directly from the barn to the porch steps. The prints weren't random or scattered. They formed a clear path like someone had walked calmly, without any rush, right up to where I was standing. The size of the boots suggested a grown man, not a kid sneaking around. I remember the cold, damp smell of the night air and the way the boards of the porch creaked under my feet as I leaned forward, following the trail with the flashlight. It ended right where I was standing, as if whoever it was had stood at the porch and looked toward the kitchen door. I backed into the house and locked the door, heart pounding against my ribs so hard it echoed in my ears. My uncle came out of his room asking what the dogs were carrying on about, and when I showed him the prints, his face went pale in a way I'd never seen before. He didn't argue this time. He grabbed the shotgun that usually hung above the mantel and told me to keep the lights off. For the first time, the old barn didn't feel like just a crumbling structure on the edge of the property. It felt occupied. The next day, we waited until daylight and went to check it out. The loft ladder was still in place, though it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But as we climbed up, we found blankets shoved into a corner, food wrappers scattered, and an old lantern with fresh soot around the glass. Someone had been living up there. The realization hit me like a weight. While I'd been sleeping just 100 yards away, a stranger had made that loft his home. We called the sheriff and he came out that afternoon with a deputy. They took a look around, asked us questions, and collected a few items. Whoever had been staying there must have known we were onto him because he never came back. The tools stopped disappearing, and no more food went missing from the kitchen. Still, the idea that we might have passed him in town without realizing it, that he might have been watching us from that window night after night, stuck with me. Even now, I can't shake the image of those muddy prints leading up to the porch. It wasn't the mess that haunted me, but the calmness in the steps, like whoever it was felt no rush, no fear, just steady confidence. To this day, whenever I think of that loft window, I wonder how many times I glanced toward it and missed a pair of eyes staring back.